The prisoners had expected to laugh, and they did. When the first American half-tracks clattered into view in the spring of 1945, rows of captured German soldiers chuckled bitterly. Some pointed at the odd machines with half-tracks of steel and half-wheels of rubber, muttering under their breath. One sneered. Not a truck, not a tank, just a crippled invention. To them, this hybrid seemed like the perfect symbol of American shortcuts. Why build true armor when you could cobble together a half measure? The laughter spread across the column of men, tired, hungry, yet still clinging to their old pride. They had served under the shadow of Panzers, the pride of the Reich. Now they looked at this strange contraption and felt reassured America had toys, Germany had steel. Yet beneath their laughter lay a truth they did not yet see. The half-track was not beautiful, not elegant, but it was relentless. As one engine idled nearby, fumes drifting into the cold air, some men felt a quiet unease. Its noise was not sharp like a Panzer's roar, but steady, grinding, almost patient. In that moment, the contrast was stark. The Panzer had been a predator, designed to strike with thunder. The half-track was something else entirely, a workhorse, tireless, indifferent to terrain or ridicule. That morning, the POWs could not imagine the full reach of this half-machine. They laughed as if their mockery could erase the sound of steel tracks chewing the mud. They did not realize that thousands of these hybrids had already carried U.S. infantry across North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes. Over 41,000 half-tracks had rolled off American assembly lines by war's end, proof of an industry that did not pause, did not falter, and did not fear ridicule. One corporal in the column, Franz Keller, scribbled in a small confiscated notebook before it was taken away. We thought we still had dignity left. Seeing those awkward machines, I almost smiled. Only later I understood it was the sound of something we could not stop. His words, discovered after the war, remind us that mockery can be a mask for dread. As the half-tracks rumbled forward, the laughter of the prisoners began to thin out, replaced by silence, in the shadows of their minds. A question pressed forward. What if this ungainly hybrid was not a joke at all, but a symbol of why they had lost? If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? For the captured men, pride became a shield against humiliation. They carried in their memories the thunder of the Panzer divisions, those armored beasts of steel that had once seemed invincible when they thought of German strength. They did not picture rifles or boots, they pictured the Panzerkampfwagen IV, the Panther, even the monstrous Tiger. Thick armor, massive guns, and the illusion of superiority. These were not merely machines. They were symbols of modern war, idols of the Reich's supposed destiny. One officer, Oberleutnant Heinrich Vogt, still spoke of them with reverence even behind the wire. A Tiger could tear through 3 of their Shermans. He muttered to his fellow prisoners, his voice filled with stubborn pride. His comrades nodded. The idea that a clumsy half-track could ever stand alongside such power was laughable. They told themselves that this was proof of German engineering genius, of discipline, of order. Yet hidden within this pride was fragility. They remembered too well how those same Tigers broke down in mud, how fuel shortages stranded Panthers on the roadside. Their mighty barrels pointed at nothing. In contrast, the Americans did not build monsters for glory, they built thousands of tools for use. Factories in Detroit and Cleveland poured out steel day and night, women in overalls tightening bolts while children collected scrap metal for production drives. While the Reich counted every liter of gasoline, the Americans shipped millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic. The numbers tell the story with a merciless clarity. By 1944, Germany could field only a few thousand Panthers and Tigers combined. In that same year, American plants rolled out over 22,000 armored fighting vehicles of all kinds. Each half-track might look unimpressive alone, but multiplied by tens of thousands, they became the bloodstream of an army that never stopped moving. Still, the prisoners clung to the image of their Panzers. One remembered standing on the turret of a Panzer IV as it rolled into Kiev in 1941, villagers staring in awe. Another recalled the confidence of advancing through France in 1940 when German steel seemed to crush all resistance. To admit that those days were over was unbearable. So when they saw the half-track, they laughed all the louder, because laughter hid despair. Inside the camps, gossip passed between bunks. Some prisoners insisted that the Americans must envy German engineering, that their half-track was only a poor man's copy of true armor. Others whispered doubts, quieter, almost ashamed. They had seen too many columns of American machines rolling without pause, while German tanks rusted in ditches for lack of fuel. The Panzer had been a weapon of shock. The half-track, they would discover, was a weapon of persistence. Pride still blinded them for now, but soon, reality would press forward on steel tracks, and their certainty would begin to crumble. The front lines had no patience for arrogance. By the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, German prisoners found themselves watching a strange spectacle that shook their certainty. Half-tracks, the very machines they had mocked, rolled tirelessly across landscapes that chewed up trucks and left tanks bogged down. One column of prisoners marched past the Ardennes forests, saw them firsthand. Snow lay thick, and mud beneath turned to sucking swamps. German supply wagons had once broken here. Wheels snapped, horses left dying in the slush. Yet the American half-tracks kept moving. The hybrid tread gripped where tires spun helplessly. The rubber wheels steered where full tracks slipped sideways. It was not elegant, but it worked, over and over. The prisoners saw soldiers dismount with dry boots, while their own men had once stood knee-deep in freezing water. An older prisoner, Feldwebel Otto Reimann, muttered to no one in particular, "A truck stops here, that thing. It doesn't..." His voice carried just enough for the guards to notice. Later, Reimann would tell a fellow captive in hushed tones, "It goes everywhere. That is the problem." His words carried the unease that laughter could no longer cover. In Italy, they had once watched half-tracks climb roads where even donkeys stumbled. In Normandy, they saw how quickly U.S. infantry regrouped, using the vehicles to bypass wreckage and craters. By 1945, whispers spread that half-tracks had been at every major battle: Kasserine, Anzio, the hedgerows of France, the Bulge. They were not heroes of headlines, not feared like tigers or panthers, but they were always there, always moving. The statistics bore out what their eyes could not deny. Between 1941 and 1945, over 41,000 M2 and M3 half-tracks were produced by American industry, International Harvester. Diamond T Autocar, names unknown to most prisoners, were churning out vehicles in numbers that dwarfed German dreams, even when American Shermans burned in combat. Replacements arrived in weeks. Half-tracks ensured the soldiers kept flowing forward, bridging the gap between armor and infantry with a speed that seemed almost unnatural. Prisoners began to argue in the barracks at night. Some still clung to pride. Yes, but against a tiger. What could it do? Others shook their heads. "It doesn't need to fight a tiger," one whispered. "It only needs to bring more men, more rifles, more guns." And it always does. The gossip mixed with bitter memory. A young conscript recalled how, during the Ardennes counteroffensive, they thought they had broken through, only to find American half-tracks rushing soldiers into the breach within hours. "We attacked," he said, "and they were already waiting." In that realization lay a cruel truth. The half-track was not about glory. It was about reach. It was about erasing distance, conquering mud, snow, rivers, and forests. It was about turning the vastness of war into something manageable, at least for one side, for the prisoners. Each sighting of those machines chipped away at their certainty. Their laughter had begun to fade. In its place grew a silence heavy with recognition. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the sight of half-tracks on the battlefield, but what followed them into captivity. The very vehicles they had ridiculed now escorted them behind barbed wire. At first, they mocked again, calling them cattle wagons as the convoys rolled into the camps. But as days passed, the laughter carried a hollowness, and eyes turned wary. A memory surfaced from the Normandy hedgerows. POWs remembered how swiftly American reinforcements had appeared after an ambush. Trucks could never have made it through the thick mud, but half-tracks had. Soldiers jumped down from them, rifles ready, turning the tide in minutes. Those same vehicles now rumbled outside the perimeter fence, their engines a constant reminder that escape was useless. What began as ridicule transformed into unease. One prisoner described the feeling in a letter, later intercepted and preserved. "They are always there. We thought our tanks made us untouchable. But here, behind wire, it is those half machines that make us helpless." The logistics shock was impossible to ignore. German officers, once schooled in the doctrine of Schwerpunkt, the concentrated armored thrust, had believed that battles were won by decisive blows. Yet the Americans fought differently. They did not rely on one strike, but on constant presence. Flooding the field with men and material, the half-track was the vessel that made this possible. The scale was staggering. By the time of the Ardennes counteroffensive, American forces could move an entire battalion, roughly 900 men, within hours, thanks to fleets of half-tracks and supporting trucks. For the Germans, shifting such numbers often took days, especially with fuel shortages. The result was a creeping despair no matter where they stood. The enemy seemed already there. Inside the barracks, gossip turned darker. Some POWs whispered that the Americans were everywhere, that there was no corner of Europe untouched by their mobility. Others argued bitterly, insisting that German valor had been betrayed by shortages, not by machines. Yet as more convoys arrived, bringing food, guards, even mail, all delivered by the same grinding tracks, silence began to dominate. One human moment lingers from Camp Swift in Texas. A German prisoner stared at a half-track parked just outside the fence. An American guard sat on its hood, eating from a tin lunchbox, simple bread, cheese, and apples. The prisoner, once a Panzer crewman, watched in disbelief. That very vehicle had carried him to captivity, and now it served as nothing more than a bench for a man eating calmly under the sun. He later told another captive, "Perhaps that is their strength. For them, even their weapons become ordinary. For us, everything had to be a symbol." What the POWs began to grasp was terrifying. In its simplicity, American power did not rest only in weapons, but in the ability to place those weapons and those men exactly where they were needed. Without delay, the half-track had erased the boundaries of distance. And with that realization came the collapse of a comforting illusion, the illusion of safe ground. Fear does not always roar. Sometimes it hums. For the German prisoners, that hum came from the steady drone of engines in the distance, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the villages of France, even in the Italian hills. The half-track was never far away. Its arrival was not heralded by fanfare or flags, but by the grinding of tracks and the squeal of brakes. For those who once laughed, it became a sound of dread. Prisoners remembered the sensation vividly. A quiet road at dusk, the crack of branches as something heavy pushed through, then the unmistakable profile of the machine bursting into view. American infantry leapt down in practiced rhythm, rifles at the ready, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. "We ran," confessed one captured Lancer years later, "but they were already there before us." Psychologically, it was devastating. The Panzers had once made Germans feel like conquerors, massive beasts, seen and admired even before they struck. The half-track did not inspire awe. Instead, it carried inevitability. You could not hide from it, whether behind a ridge or in the back streets of a shattered town. The prisoners recalled how quickly Americans arrived, often hours after German troops thought they had slipped away. The statistics were cruel. During the Normandy campaign alone, over 15,000 half-tracks were deployed, moving infantry, engineers, even medics into positions where German defenders had believed they had time to regroup. Every mile of ground seemed to shorten for the Americans, for the prisoners. The lesson was bitter while German tanks thundered gloriously in one direction. American vehicles appeared everywhere at once, inside the camps. This realization seeped into daily gossip. Some men laughed nervously, muttering that the Americans fight with wheels, not courage. Others sat silent, haunted by memories of how often their own retreats had been cut short by men delivered in those same ungainly machines. The old mockery felt dangerous now, as if speaking it aloud would invite those tracks back into their dreams. A human moment stands out from a camp near Fort Riley. One night, during a rainstorm, a POW heard the rumble of a half-track outside the wire. He pressed his ear to the wooden wall, listening as its engine idled through the storm. He later admitted to a fellow prisoner, "I could not sleep. Every time I hear that sound, I feel hunted again." The weight of inevitability left scars deeper than battle wounds. For the Germans, it meant that even when surrender brought safety, the memory of pursuit never left. And here is where I turn to you. Watching this story unfold, imagine being in their place, hearing that relentless engine through the trees. Would you have felt fear or admiration? Tell us in the comments what your answer would be. The prisoners had laughed at first, but now they whispered admissions in the shadows of their barracks. By 1945, many no longer spoke proudly of tanks and armor, but of the simple truth they had witnessed the war was not won by the heaviest gun, but by the fastest reach. Half-tracks embodied that reach. Letters home, carefully censored by camp authorities, revealed the shift in tone. One soldier wrote to his wife in Bremen, "We believed our Tigers ruled the battlefield, but the Americans, they move like the wind. Their machines carry them as if they have wings of iron." These words never reached her, but the copy remained in the archives, a testimony to the bitter recognition. It was not just military strength, it was rhythm. German offensives lunged forward and then stalled, their machines stranded by fuel shortages or breakdowns. American advances never seemed to stall. Supplies of bread, ammunition, and medicine arrived in half-tracks alongside soldiers. Even the wounded were carried back with speed that astonished the prisoners, who remembered comrades left to bleed because panzer crews could not risk halting. The numbers told the same story. By 1945, 41,000 half-tracks had been produced, many still rolling strong after years of war. Compare this to Germany's struggling output. Only around 1,300 Tiger IIs ever left their factories. Most too heavy to cross bridges or too fuel-hungry to reach the front. One was a weapon of prestige, the other was a tool of persistence. For the POWs, the lesson was crushing. Pride in German engineering no longer softened their defeat. Instead, they began to say it aloud, America's victory was one of mobility. A prisoner at Camp Concordia confessed to an American guard, half in jest but with a hollow voice, "We had tanks, but you had an army that could fly across the earth." Daily camp life reinforced the point. Half-tracks brought crates of supplies, guards to rotate shifts, even mail from home for American soldiers. Every sight of those vehicles reminded the prisoners that the same relentless movement that crushed them on the battlefield now kept their captivity running smoothly. The ideological contrast was stark. They had believed in the superiority of steel monsters, in a war defined by shock and awe. What they faced instead was an enemy who turned every stretch of land into a road, who made the very earth itself complicit in their advance. And perhaps the most bitter recognition of all was this victory came not from pride, but from practicality. The prisoners could no longer deny it. So let me ask you, watching now, what do you think truly wins wars? Fearsome weapons, or the unseen power of logistics? Share your thoughts below, because history often hides its real lessons in places we overlook. Time moved on, but the sound lingered. Long after surrender, after transport ships, after the barbed wire of American camps gave way to repatriation. The memory of the half-track endured in the minds of the men who once mocked it. It was not the cannon blasts or the thunder of artillery that haunted them most. It was the low, grinding snarl of tracks pulling across mud, gravel, and snow, reminding them of how quickly the Americans had appeared, again and again, without pause. Some former prisoners admitted it years later. In interviews and memoirs, "When I close my eyes," said one, "I do not see the Tiger I once crewed. I hear the sound of those American machines, and I know that was the sound of our defeat." The humiliation was sharper for those who had laughed loudest, calling the half-track a crippled invention. They could not escape the irony that what they dismissed as weakness had become the very symbol of American strength. Museums in Europe and America now display these vehicles. In Stuttgart, a former POW once stood silently before one, staring at its preserved steel. The paint was fresh, the tracks polished for display, but to him it was not an artifact, it was a memory. He told a curator quietly, "That is the sound of war arriving. You never forget it." Statistics faded into insignificance against these personal recollections. 41,000 built. Thousands deployed in every theater, yes, the numbers mattered, but for those who lived it. The weight of memory was heavier than any figure. One diary fragment from a German sergeant summed it best. "The Americans came with engines. We heard them before we saw them. The laughter died in our throats." The symbolic contrast could not have been sharper. German tanks, titans of propaganda, lay rusting in fields and forests, monuments to hubris. The American half-track, mocked for its clumsy design, became a survivor of history, its tracks still intact, its story still rolling forward. The final image remains striking, a half-track under museum lights, its metal links gleaming softly, as if waiting to grind forward once more. For the men who once stood on the other side of the wire, it is not an object of ridicule anymore. It is the sound of inevitability, the machine that erased their pride, and the memory that never released them. History is often remembered through the roar of cannons, the clash of armies, and the thunder of great machines. Yet, when the war ended and the soldiers laid down their arms, the memories that lingered were not always the loudest or the most glorious. For many German prisoners, the symbol of their defeat was not the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber, it was the humble half-track, grinding steadily forward, never pausing, never failing to arrive. What had begun as laughter, as sneers in the spring of 1945, became silence as realization took hold. The half-track was not beautiful, nor was it terrifying in appearance, but it carried with it the essence of American power mobility, persistence, the ability to appear where no one expected. It was not a machine of prestige, but of presence, and presence, multiplied by thousands, is what crushed the illusion of safety, of distance, of German superiority. There is something deeply human in this lesson. Pride blinds us to what seems ungainly, ordinary, or unworthy of respect. The German prisoners laughed because they wanted to believe their world of steel giants was unshakable. Yet, history has a way of punishing arrogance with quiet, relentless truths. The half-track was one of those truths. It reminded them that wars are not won by symbols, but by systems, not by isolated moments of brilliance, but by sustained endurance. One former soldier, decades later, admitted that he still dreamed of the sound of rivet guns in American factories, of the endless convoys that never ceased, even in peace. He could not escape the rhythm of industry turned to war. Perhaps that is the deepest scar of all, not the battles themselves, but the recognition that victory belonged to those who made every road passable, every mile surmountable. The half-track remains in museums now, silent, harmless, its steel tracks polished under glass, yet it still speaks. It speaks of laughter turned to fear, of pride turned to recognition, of the quiet power that shapes history more than thunder ever could.